I've said this before a few times, but when we analyze the rhetoric of a text, we're doing two things. We're examining what a writer does to achieve their purpose and why they do it this way. So, since everything we communicate is an argument, when you analyze a particular rhetorical choice in a rhetorical analysis essay, for instance, you're making two different but related arguments. You're making a what argument and a why argument. Specifically, you're trying to argue that the rhetorical choice you have identified is something the writer does, and that the rhetorical choice is necessary in order for the writer to accomplish something. That's arguing the what and the why. And when you write a topic sentence in a rhetorical analysis essay correctly, your topic sentence should contain the claim for both of these arguments. Yeah, in a rhetorical analysis essay, the body paragraph topic sentences need to identify a specific rhetorical technique and briefly explain its intended effects. So what you're doing there is you're giving the claim for the what does the writer do, and briefly giving a claim for the why does the writer do it. For example, if I were studying Florence Kelly's speech against child labor, one of the topic statements from the 3 sample body paragraphs that I showed you guys, one of the topic statements reads, Kelly begins her speech by opening her audience's eyes with overwhelming data on child labor in America. What 2 claims am I making with this one statement? Here, I'm claiming that Florence Kelly uses overwhelming data on child labor in America. That's my what argument. And I'm also claiming that Florence Kelly's use of overwhelming data is necessary to make her audience aware of the seriousness of the issue. That's what I mean here by opening her audience's eyes. So there's the claim pertaining to my why argument. Let's take a look at another example. This is from the second body paragraph. My topic statement reads, Kelly attempts to open her audience's hearts to the plight of the children with appeals to pity and shame. What 2 claims am I making with this one statement? Well, one claim I'm making is that Florence Kelly uses appeals to pity and shame. That's my what argument. The other claim I'm making is that Florence Kelly's use of these emotional appeals is necessary to make her audience feel strongly about the exploitation of child laborers. That's what I mean by opening their hearts to the plight of the children. And that would be the claim for my why argument. Let's pause for a quick check for understanding. See if you can identify the 2 different claims I'm making with the next topic statement. In this topic statement, I'm claiming that Florence Kelly creates a moral imperative. That's my what claim. And I'm also claiming that Florence Kelly's moral imperative is necessary to link her cause with the cause of the audience, the cause that the audience is already fighting. That's the claim for my why argument. The 4-part analysis structure that we've taught you, where we've taught you to identify the technique first, support it with text evidence, explain the effects, connect it to obstacles and purpose. That 4-part structure begins by making you argue the what argument first and the why argument second. Yeah, you start with the what argument, which is your claim that a rhetorical technique is present, and your evidence is all that text evidence you give showing how the claim exists or is present in the text. Then you move on to the why argument, where your claim there is all the intended effects that the technique has on the audience, and your evidence is the connection to the obstacle and purpose. Why have we taught you to go in this order, to argue the what first and then the why second? Well, it makes the most logical sense. You have to prove that something exists first before you can then prove why it exists. If we were to flip this the other way around, it would be very confusing. Once you begin seeing your analysis as a series of what and why arguments, you can then use the same methods you have learned for evaluating the strength of your arguments to evaluate the strength of your analyses and to make sure that what you're analyzing makes sense. So let's look more closely at both the what and the why arguments and how they work in an analysis. Once again, in your analysis, the what argument is what you start off with in your paragraph. And that what argument is made up of the rhetorical technique that you say exists in the text that the writer is using, and the text evidence that you pull from the text that's demonstrating that the technique is in fact used. Here is my first what argument from the first sample body paragraph that I've shared with you guys of my analysis of Florence Kelley's speech against child labor. My claim is that Florence Kelley uses overwhelming data on child labor in America. And I give 4 different evidence statements here, 4 different pieces of text evidence that I've pulled to show how she does this. First, she gives statistics on the number of child workers in the U.S. Then she identifies a trend that is these teenage girls that are the fastest growing group of workers in America. She then gives multiple examples of southern states with terrible child labor laws, and then gives multiple examples of northern states with terrible child labor laws. Those are all different text evidence examples that are supporting that claim that this technique is present in the text. Mapped out, this what argument would look something like this. My claim there at the bottom, and then my 4 supporting evidence statements above it and leading down to it. So by looking at this first half of my analysis as an argument, I can now test the strength of my analysis by asking the same questions that we ask for any argument. Is my claim clear, precise, and appropriate to the discussion? Well, my claim here that Florence Kelley uses overwhelming data on child labor in America, that is a technique, so it's clear and it's precise. And since identifying rhetorical techniques is what I'm supposed to do in a rhetorical analysis, I'd say this claim is appropriate to the discussion. Is my evidence accurate in support of my claim? Well, let's just see. Does she actually do the things that I say she does? Yep, she gives those statistics. Yes, she does demonstrate that trend of teenage girls growing faster than any other demographic. And yes, she does give multiple examples of state laws on child labor. Is my evidence relevant in its support of my claim? Well, statistics are a kind of data. Trends that we conclude from statistics or observe in statistics, they're also a kind of data. And even examples are sort of like data. They're like research data. And so all of these fall into that grouping, that classification of data. And so, yeah, I'd say that these examples, this evidence, is relevant. Lastly, is my evidence sufficient in its support of my claim? Well, I cite 4 different ways that she does this. They're present across lines 1 through 26, which is almost half of the text. That seems sufficient enough to be considered an overwhelming amount of data. So yeah, I'd say it's sufficient in its support of my claim. Moving from the what argument to the why argument now. In your analysis, the why argument is made up of the second half of your paragraph. The claim is when you elaborate on the intended effects on the audience. And the evidence supporting that claim is explaining why the effects are needed. So in this case, it's why they're needed in terms of overcoming rhetorical constraints, meaning what is getting in the writer's way, what obstacles are present that the writer needs to overcome, and how those are needed to achieve specific supporting purposes. So in that final statement, when you explain why it's necessary to even overcome these constraints. My why argument from the second half of that sample paragraph, the claim could be this: Kelley's use of overwhelming data is necessary to enlighten her audience to the seriousness and scope of the issue. That's kind of how I explained the intended effects there. And my 2 evidence statements, first connecting to obstacle, her audience is likely not fully aware of the seriousness of the issue of child labor because they have not had to send their children into the workforce since they are predominantly middle and upper class. Then the connection to purpose, she needs her audience to be aware of this issue before she can make them care about the issue. So there I have my claim and 2 different lines of reasoning, 2 different evidence statements supporting that claim. Mapped out, this argument is a little more complex, but not terribly. Down there at the bottom, you'll see my claim. Kelley's use of overwhelming data is intended to enlighten her audience to the seriousness and scope of this issue. And supporting that are two different reasons, two different lines of reasoning. One, that her audience is likely not fully aware of the seriousness of child labor, and the other one, that she needs her audience to be aware of the issue. And as you can see, this one kind of moves upward because there's additional reasons that support those reasons. Why does she need her audience to be aware of the issue? Well, it's because she needs to make them care about the issue. And the reasoning there being, of course, you can't care about something unless you're aware of it. Why does she, or why is her audience likely not aware of the seriousness of child labor? Well, it's because they have not had to send their children into the workforce because they are predominantly middle and upper class. So I've fully mapped out the reasoning here that's going on in my analysis. Once again, I can test the strength of this second half of my analysis by asking the same questions we asked before. Is my claim clear, precise, and appropriate to the discussion? Well, looking at my claim here, it identifies two clear and precise intended effects to enlighten the audience to the number of child workers, to enlighten the audience to the scope of child labor in America, how widespread it is. And since discussing the intended effects of a rhetorical choice is what I'm supposed to do in an analysis, I'd say it's an appropriate part of the discussion here, so it's definitely appropriate. Moving on to my evidence. Is my evidence accurate in its support of my claim? Well, this obstacle here does seem reasonable. The kind of women who can attend the sort of conference that Kelly's speaking at would not be the ones who have to send their children off to work. So I'd say this is a reasonably accurate thing to say since it just makes sense. Is my evidence relevant in its support of my claim? Well, the obstacle and the effects that I explained have a clear cause and effect relationship. Because the audience was not aware, therefore she makes the audience aware. That sort of cause and effect makes this definitely relevant in its support. Lastly, is my evidence sufficient in its support of my claim? Well, I've explained both why it is necessary to the situation and why it's necessary to the primary purpose. That seems sufficient to explain why it's necessary that the writer does this.